Every major car manufacturer on Earth has pledged to go electric. Governments are spending trillions. Entire oil economies are bracing for collapse. But what if the electric vehicle revolution was not driven by what consumers wanted, but by what governments decided they needed? We are living through what analysts call the greatest transformation of the automotive industry since the invention of the combustion engine. From Berlin to Beijing, from Detroit to Delhi, every major economy on Earth has announced a deadline to eliminate the petrol car. But behind the glossy marketing campaigns and the billion-dollar factory announcements, a more complicated picture is emerging. Because when you strip away the subsidies, the tax credits, and the government mandates, the data tells a very different story about whether the world actually wants electric vehicles, or whether it has simply been told that it does. The modern electric vehicle story did not begin in a consumer focus group. It began in a government boardroom. In 1990, the California Air Resources Board issued the Zero-Emission Vehicle Mandate, one of the most consequential regulatory acts in automotive history. It required that a percentage of all cars sold in California produce zero tailpipe emissions. At the time, no consumer had demanded this. No mass market existed. No charging infrastructure was in place. The mandate was born from a political response to air quality concerns in Los Angeles, a city so choked with smog that breathing the air was medically classified as hazardous. This single act planted a seed. But for the next 2 decades, the electric vehicle remained a fringe product, bought by environmentally motivated early adopters, not mainstream consumers. Then, between 2008 and 2012, something changed. Not in consumer behavior, but in government policy. The United States introduced a USD 7,500 federal tax credit for EV purchases. The European Union began constructing its emissions trading scheme. China launched what would become the most aggressive state-directed EV program in history, pouring over USD 57 billion into subsidies, factory construction, and battery supply chains. The global EV industry was not born from the invisible hand of the market. It was built, deliberately, by the visible hand of the state. To understand what is really happening with the electric vehicle, you need to understand the interests involved, because they are not simply about saving the planet. China. The People's Republic had a problem. It was the world's largest importer of crude oil, spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually on foreign energy. It was also decades behind the West in mastering the internal combustion engine. German, Japanese, and American automakers dominated the global car market with technology that China could not replicate competitively. The electric vehicle offered China a clean sheet of paper. Battery technology, electric motors, and software-defined vehicles were arenas where no single nation had built an insurmountable lead. Yet, Beijing identified this window and moved with extraordinary speed. Today, China controls over 75% of global lithium-ion battery manufacturing capacity, and Chinese automakers like BYD have become the world's largest EV sellers by volume. The EV was not just a climate policy for China, it was industrial strategy and geopolitical repositioning. Europe. The European Union's EV push is driven by a different anxiety: regulatory coherence and climate commitments made under international treaty obligations. The EU's 2035 ban on new petrol and diesel car sales is essentially a regulatory forcing function, compelling manufacturers to invest in electric infrastructure whether consumer demand justifies it or not. European automakers like Volkswagen, Renault, and Stellantis initially embraced this direction, but have since begun lobbying furiously for delays as their EV sales lag behind targets in core markets, including Germany, France, and Italy. The United States. Under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, Washington committed approximately USD 369 billion toward climate and clean energy initiatives, a significant portion directed at EVs. The intent was dual: reduce carbon emissions and reshore battery and vehicle manufacturing to counter Chinese industrial dominance. In each case, the government was not responding to consumer demand. It was attempting to create it. Here is where the narrative becomes genuinely complicated. In 2023, several of the world's largest automakers, Ford, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, publicly revised their EV production targets downward. Ford reported losses of approximately USD 4.7 billion on its EV division in that year alone. GM delayed the launch of multiple electric models. Hertz, which had purchased 100,000 Tesla vehicles, began selling off its electric fleet and returning to petrol cars, citing higher-than-expected repair costs and weaker consumer demand. In markets without subsidies, Norway being a notable exception because of extraordinary government incentives, EV adoption rates have proven significantly more modest. The barriers are consistent across markets: purchase price premium, charging anxiety, the fear of running out of power far from infrastructure, long charge times compared to a 2-minute refueling stop, and a resale value uncertainty that makes financial planning difficult. In developing economies, India, Southeast Asia, most of Africa, these barriers are compounded by electricity grid reliability, income constraints, and the near-total absence of charging infrastructure outside major urban centers. The uncomfortable question for policymakers is this: if you remove the subsidies, the mandates, and the tax credits, does the EV stand on its own commercial feet? In many markets, the honest answer today is not yet. There is a second crisis hiding beneath the electric vehicle transition, one that rarely appears in the marketing campaigns: the grid. Electrifying personal transportation at scale requires an enormous expansion of electricity generation and distribution infrastructure. In the United Kingdom, the national grid has estimated that full EV adoption could require up to 100 gigawatts of additional generation capacity, equivalent to roughly 100 new nuclear power stations. In the United States, the Department of Energy has warned that the existing grid infrastructure in many states is simply not capable of supporting mass EV adoption without significant and expensive upgrades. And here is the deeper irony. A significant portion of that electricity still comes from fossil fuels. In countries where coal or natural gas remains the dominant electricity source, including large parts of China, India, and Eastern Europe, an electric vehicle may produce more life cycle carbon emissions than a modern fuel-efficient petrol car, once you account for the manufacturing of the battery and the carbon intensity of the power grid charging it. The EV, in these contexts, is not a zero-emission vehicle. It is a displaced emission vehicle. The exhaust pipe has simply moved from the car's tailpipe to a power station chimney hundreds of kilometers away. If the 20th century was defined by the geopolitics of oil, the 21st century is increasingly being shaped by the geopolitics of the battery. Electric vehicles require lithium, cobalt, nickel, and manganese in quantities that existing mining operations are struggling to provide. The world does not yet have the mining infrastructure, the refining capacity, or the supply chain depth to electrify global personal transportation at the speed governments are mandating. Lithium is concentrated in the so-called lithium triangle of South America, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. Cobalt is predominantly sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where human rights organizations have documented serious concerns about artisanal mining conditions. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative and strategic corporate acquisitions, has secured dominant positions in the processing and refining of most of these critical minerals. Even where raw materials are mined in other countries, they frequently pass through Chinese refineries before entering global battery supply chains. The West's EV transition, intended in part to reduce dependence on authoritarian petrostates in the Middle East and Russia, may be inadvertently creating a new and equally uncomfortable dependency, this time on Chinese-controlled mineral supply chains. Here is the truth that the industry press releases and the government announcements rarely state plainly. The electric vehicle is not, primarily, a consumer product revolution. It is a policy-driven industrial transformation that governments have decided must happen for reasons that are simultaneously about climate, geopolitics, energy security, and industrial competition. The climate argument is real and scientifically well-grounded. Long-term electrification of transport, powered by renewable energy, would significantly reduce carbon emissions from one of the world's largest polluting sectors. But the timeline, the mandates, the 2035 deadlines, the subsidy cliffs, these are political constructs. They reflect the intersection of climate treaty obligations, industrial lobbying, and competitive anxiety about Chinese technological dominance, more than they reflect where consumer demand naturally stands today. This does not mean the electric vehicle is a gimmick. The technology is real. The long-term trajectory is almost certainly toward electrification. Battery costs have fallen approximately 97% over the last 3 decades and continue to decline. But the honest assessment is this: the EV revolution, as currently constituted, is running ahead of infrastructure, ahead of grid capacity, ahead of supply chains, and in many markets, ahead of what consumers are organically willing to pay for without government support. The question is not whether electric vehicles will eventually dominate global roads. They almost certainly will. The question is whether the forced pace of the transition, driven by government mandate rather than market readiness, will create economic distortions, geopolitical vulnerabilities, and industrial casualties that could have been avoided with a more measured approach. History is full of technological transitions that were, in hindsight, inevitable, but that in their own time were driven as much by political will as by consumer demand. The interstate highway system, the internet, commercial aviation, all required extraordinary government intervention before markets could take over. The electric vehicle may follow the same path. The subsidy scaffolding may eventually come down. The infrastructure may catch up. The grid may decarbonize. The supply chains may diversify. But until that day, the honest answer to the question of whether the EV revolution is real is that it is both real and manufactured. It is the future, deployed on a political timetable that the market, left alone, would not have chosen. And in the modern world, the most powerful economic force is not always consumer preference. Sometimes it is a government decision made in a boardroom, disguised as a revolution. This is narration script. Narrator should have a deep and authoritative voice. Use your stock videos for B-rolls. I upload some photos. Use them as well and create a video.